Hello, my name is Anna Zbona. I work at an international human rights organization called the Business and Human Rights Research Center. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'll be speaking about the impacts of transition minerals mining in the climate crisis and wanted to bring this context to the tribunal. So in the latest International Energy Agency Global Outlook, we were alerted that the world is continuing to see a growing demand for minerals in the energy transition. In recent months, we have seen governments in the global north primarily rushing to secure their minerals supply chains. And while it is indisputable that climate change is the greatest threat to human rights, we also know that mining activities are also very risky for people and the planet. We don't have to choose between fighting climate change and protecting human rights. A just transition must mean working towards greater global equity and equality, which means that first policy options to reduce demand for new minerals must be considered. We know that new minerals will still be needed at scale. And that means, as we're going to be discussing, that a lot still needs to be done to ensure communities, indigenous peoples, and workers' rights are fully respected in mining operations. Next slide, please. To paint the global picture of impacts of transition minerals extraction, I'll lift up some key findings and recommendations from the 5th edition of the Transition and Minerals Tracker. So, launched in 2019, the Business and Human Rights Research Center launched a transition minerals tracker, which monitors risks of human rights abuses across all geographies associated with significant and large scale mining operations of key minerals for renewable energy technologies, electrification, and batteries. In 2024, we have also expanded the scope of minerals that we cover with the new addition of bauxite, along with cobalt, copper, lithium, manganese, nickel, and zinc. The tracker is a yearly updated database of records of publicly reported alleged abuses by companies. And we are including lawsuits, regulatory actions, publicly reported attacks against human rights defenders, and other types of attacks that are related to business activities. We started in 2010. We now have 13 years of data. And as we only include publicly available information, which is obviously very restricted in some parts of the world, coupled with limited means of action for affected parties and fears of reprisals, that of course can translate into underreporting of abuses. So next slide, please. We have now collected over 600 allegations of abuse associated with more than 2,000 impacts across the 6 categories we use for analysis. So we analyze impacts on local communities, impacts on human rights defenders, land rights protection, public participation issues, indigenous peoples' rights, environment, workers, labor rights, governance and transparency related issues, security and conflict, and issues related to the mining operations handling of COVID-19 related situations. So first, I want to just say that those are not watertight categories. They don't do a perfect job at describing the realities lived by communities on the ground. For example, stakeholders are often the very same individuals and families whose members may work at the mine, etc. So do take these categories with a grain of salt. But a too frequent pattern that we see in these statistics is that very often the cases start with environmental violation, particularly water and soil pollution, compounded by limited or absent consultation with local residents, leading to protracted conflict and ultimately to attacks on human rights defenders. Just to give you one example, the Las Bambas copper mine in Peru is a case in point, ranking number 1 in this year's tracker for the 3rd year in a row, with 68 allegations across all years. Copper is in general associated with the highest number of allegations. About 50% of all cases and 60% of all attacks against human rights defenders is related to copper extraction, possibly reflecting severe issues with the protection of civic freedoms in countries endowed with large copper reserves in South America. Peru is the country associated with the highest number of allegations in this regard. Next slide, please. Now, a word on companies associated with these allegations. We have 110 companies associated with at least one allegation, but only 20 are connected with more than 2/3 of allegations, which means there is a concentration of allegations being connected just to a few companies. And those are some of the most established and biggest in the sector. Only 39% of all the companies that we track have a human rights policy in place, which does not even say whether the policy is good or not. So that's a pretty dismal figure. Next slide, please. So now I'd like to share about some impact categories. So 61 allegations are impacting indigenous peoples, including 36 cases of violation of their right to free, prior, informed consent, or that are linked to displacement and forced relocation, in addition to water pollution and impacts on land rights. We know that more than 50% of the world's transition minerals reserves are located near or on indigenous peoples' lands and territories. So this just highlights how indigenous peoples' resources and indigenous peoples themselves are deeply affected and disproportionately affected by the current boom in transition minerals. This was the slide on indigenous. So next slide, please. Just a little bit more on the impacts on human rights defenders as well. So 1 in 4 allegations in the transition minerals tracker is an attack against a human rights defender. We include in attacks judicial harassment, which includes arbitrary detention, strategic lawsuits against public participation, intimidation, threats, injuries, killings, denial of freedom of expression and association. So this is unfortunately unsurprising, as mining is the most dangerous sector for defenders, according to our database of attacks on defenders that we also have on our website. Mining has been associated with the largest attacks on defenders ever since we started tracking in 2015. So this reality is basically confirmed through the findings in the transition minerals tracker. And such attacks on defenders are, of course, not standalone events. There is a continuum between affected rights and attacks on those defending them. Those attacks often aim to suppress their voices and delegitimize their asks. So I think I'll just skip forward to a few recommendations at the very end. And so in terms of recommendations, there are many more, but 3 key ones that we would like to uplift here are that all companies need to be doing proper human rights due diligence. Audits and certifications are not sufficient in this regard, and human rights due diligence needs to be made mandatory by governments. As we see, there is a current trend against this, despite some successes or a positive trend in the past. We just saw the European Union CSDDD law being sort of questioned right at this moment and watered down. We are sure that these better policies and laws are within reach, and they need to be prioritized as we move towards the energy transition. We also want to highlight that 3 key principles need to guide responsible business action. One is this focus on shared prosperity, which means moving away from corporate social responsibility type actions and towards real responsibility and business models that share benefits equitably with workers, indigenous peoples, etc. We also want to see more gender-sensitive human rights due diligence and also fair negotiations with workers, communities, human rights defenders, and we want to see the centering of fundamental rights such as free, prior, and informed consent, the right to unionize, and zero tolerance for attacks against defenders. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.